Think of a wooden horse and a love heart. The latest from Podnews.net with Climavores, the podcast for healthy food and a healthy planet. Podtrac published its top 25 new podcasts of 2022 by average downloads per episode. The number one is, have you guessed it, The Trojan Horse Affair from the New York Times. It measures participating publishers only. Podcast host Ausha has achieved IAB certification. The company was already following the ACPM guidelines, one of two French podcast audience measurement organizations. Ausha's press release includes an infographic explaining what an IAB download is. You'll find it linked from our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Spotify's Anchor continues to lose market share. It was down to 21.6% of all new podcast episodes in November, but Spotify's overall market share remains the same after Megaphone posted the biggest share increase in the top 15 podcast hosts. In other data, Podtrac remains the largest prefix tracking service. Amazon still runs podcasting, with CloudFront delivering 50% of all episodes in November, including this one, and our data shows Anchor is still gaining podcasters. 136 podcasters moved to Anchor last month, the hosting company gaining 75 overall. Megaphone gained 78 new shows in our sample. Podchaser has launched Podchaser Alerts, which allows users to track podcast episodes for their target key phrase and receive daily alerts of new mentions. Your first alert is free. YouTube has launched a podcast, Like and Describe. YouTube's first ever official Trends podcast is, of course, available on YouTube itself, but also on all podcast platforms. It's hosted by Captivate. After 240,000 votes, the Swedish Golden Podcast Awards has announced its winners for 2022. Podcast of the Year went to a war history podcast, but Best International Podcast of the Year, with 15.4% of the vote, was Crime Junkie. There were more than 10,000 nominations. iHeart's podcast payments to Senator Ted Cruz break Senate ethics rules, claimed the non-partisan Campaign Legal Center. He could go to prison. But what do you think might happen? Bloomberg reports that SiriusXM is to cut staff after impact from a slowdown in new car sales. NPR, though, is avoiding layoffs after a revenue fall, according to a report from the company, but has implemented a near freeze on hiring. In Australia, the subject of The Teacher's Pet podcast, Chris Dawson, was sentenced to 24 years in prison for murdering his wife Lynette. The 74-year-old will be eligible for parole in 2040, and Will Arnett is hosting a World Cup live chat on Amazon's AMP. There's a podcast version exclusive to Amazon Music too. And in People News, Rob Greenlee has a new job. He's now SVP, Content and Partnerships at Podbean, a podcast Hall of Famer. He'd been at Libsyn since 2019. And among the jobs we're currently listing, how about this one? Manager of Podcasts for the ABC in Australia. You'll find that linked from our show notes and our newsletter and at podnews.net/jobs. And in podcast news, in the Podcast Weekly Review this week, Dan Meisner talks about the topics that appeared hidden in Apple Podcasts and what he's done with them. And Australian podcaster Trevor Bell questions all of our excitement about micropayments with Satoshis.
All of these experts have become quite obsessed with Satoshis and boostergrams. The alternatives are a lot better.
You can find out more in the Pod News Weekly Review this week. Also, a podcast called Audience has Sam Sethi from the Pod News Weekly Review on the show, talking about its name change, and also talking about Elon Musk and micropayments. He couldn't help himself, could he? Repod is a new podcast series focusing on the European podcasting industry. The first guest is Joanna Avelen, who is International Expansion Director at Acast. It's made by Bulla Media in Brussels in Belgium, and Greenlit is a podcast that was launched in May 2021, but it's only now that the team have thought about sending us the launch press release, which we think is some kind of record. We've deleted it, obviously, but it's a clever idea, though. It's a comedy podcast where comedians learn that their life is to be made into a film, and over the course of the episode, they ask what the film will be called, who's in it, and which parts of their life have to be included or excluded. It's had some pretty big name guests too. It's presented by Toby Earle and produced by Danny Garlick. And this podcast is sponsored by Climavores. Climavores is a podcast for eaters who are trying to navigate the complex relationship between healthy food and a healthy planet. Hosted by journalists Tamar Haspel and Mike Grunwald, they explore the complicated, confusing and surprising relationship between food and the environment. From Postscript Media, listen to Climavores wherever you get your podcasts. And we thank them for their support over the last couple of weeks. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.